Some stories begin at the end of something, not the dramatic end, not fire or flood, or the sharp crack of a rifle. The quiet end, the kind that comes wrapped in a plain envelope delivered by a man who cannot meet your eyes on a platform in a town you have never seen before, under a sky so wide and indifferent it makes you feel like a single drop stitch in an enormous quilt. This is one of those stories, and it begins with a woman named Eleanor Marsh. She was 28 years old and she was sitting in the second car of a westbound train, watching the landscape of America unspool outside the window, like a dream she hadn't asked to have. The farmland of Kansas had long since given way to something harder and more honest. Dry brown earth scrub brush, the occasional stand of cottonwoods huddled together like old men sharing a secret. The Rocky Mountains had appeared on the horizon 2 days ago at first, just a suggestion, a blue smudge against the sky. Now they were real and enormous and close, their peaks still capped with summer snow, and Eleanor Marsh looked at them with the expression of someone who had run out of the luxury of being afraid. She had been on this train for 6 days. In her lap she held a letter. She did not need to open it. She had read it so many times that the paper had softened at the folds, that the ink had begun to blur in one corner from being handled on a damp morning outside of Cincinnati. She knew every word. She had measured every sentence for warmth and found it adequate. Not warm, but adequate. The letter was from a man named Harold Fenwick, a merchant of Millstone Creek, Colorado, who had advertised for a wife of steady character and practical disposition, and to whom she had responded 3 months ago with careful measured words of her own. His letters had been brief, proper. He described himself as a man of modest means, a man of steady habits. He had a home. He had a business. He had, as he put it in his second letter, a need for a capable woman to share the work of a life. She had folded those words into her heart and called them enough, because what was behind her in Ohio was nothing. Not nothing in the careless sense that people sometimes use the word. Nothing in the true sense. The farmhouse where she had been born was gone, sold the previous autumn, to settle debts that had accumulated like snow during the 2 years since her parents had died. Influenza had taken them within a week of each other in the February of 1878, as if one had simply refused to stay in a world the other had left. She had nursed them both, changed their fever cloths, held their hands. She had buried them in the cold ground of the church cemetery, and then stood in the empty farmhouse kitchen, and understood for the first time in her life what it meant to have nothing anchoring you to any particular place on earth. She was a woman without a home, and so she had done what a woman without a home and without illusions does. She had answered an advertisement. She had packed a single worn valise. She had taken a seat on a westbound train, and she had not let herself look back. In her valise, 2 spare dresses, her mother's herb journal, its pages filled with decades of spidery script detailing remedies and recipes stained with turmeric and rosemary, and the ghosts of 100 kitchen afternoons, a brush, a bar of lye soap, and $31, which was everything she had in the world. She refolded Harold Fenwick's last letter and tucked it into her dress pocket. Outside, a hawk circled lazily over the dry plain, riding a thermal updraft with the kind of effortless patience that Eleanor had always admired and never quite managed. The train swayed. The wheels clattered their steady rhythm against the iron rails. Around her, the other passengers dozed or read or stared out their own windows with their own private calculations. Eleanor Marsh did not sleep. She watched the mountains get closer and she thought about kitchens. Specifically, she thought about what kind of kitchen Harold Fenwick's house might have. She hoped for a good cast-iron stove. She hoped for a proper root cellar. She thought about the herbs she would plant in the first spring, thyme and sage and the flat-leaf parsley her mother had always insisted upon. She built the kitchen in her mind brick by brick because it was easier than thinking about the man and because a kitchen was something she understood. Men, in her experience, were more complicated than any kitchen. She arrived at the station in Millstone Creek at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon in July of 1880. The town was small and sun-bleached and honest about it. A single main street of clapboard storefronts baked under a high Colorado sky. There was a blacksmith, a general store, a small church at the far end of the road with a modest white steeple. There were horses tied at posts. There were men moving with the unhurried purpose of people accustomed to hard work and dry heat. The air smelled of pine and dust and the sharp mineral tang of elevation, and Eleanor stood on the platform and breathed it in and felt for one suspended moment the particular hope that only the unfamiliar can produce. She was looking for Harold Fenwick. What she found instead was a young man in a too large jacket standing at the edge of the platform and looking at her the way people look at things they would rather not have to deal with. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed, clerk at Fenwick's Mercantile. He twisted the brim of his hat in his hands as he spoke. He did not quite look at her face. He told her in a voice that started fast and then slowed down as if each word was heavier than the last that Mr. Fenwick sent his regrets. That was the phrase he used. His regrets. Eleanor waited. The sky was very blue above the platform. A horse stamped its foot somewhere behind her. Thomas Reed explained that Mr. Fenwick had, in the time since his last letter to her, made the acquaintance of a Miss Clara Aldrich, whose father owned the local livery stable. He explained that Mr. Fenwick and Miss Aldrich had been married the previous Tuesday. He explained that Mr. Fenwick wished her a safe journey and had asked Thomas to deliver an envelope, which Thomas now produced from inside his jacket, with the expression of a man diffusing something. Eleanor took the envelope. She did not open it. She already knew what was inside: a handful of bills, conscience money enough to buy a ticket back east, which was what Harold Fenwick hoped she would do, because it would make everything neat and concluded and would allow him to never think of her again. She held the envelope, and she looked at Thomas Reed, and she said very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Reed." And then something happened that she had not anticipated. She became aware of another presence on the platform. A woman standing near the far end, partially turned away, but present in the particular way of someone who has just realized they are witnessing something they should not be witnessing. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, with a round, pleasant face and light brown hair pinned neatly under a good hat. She was carrying a small basket. She had the look of someone who had come to meet someone and had arrived slightly early. Their eyes met. And Eleanor understood with the swift and terrible clarity of a woman who has always been good at reading rooms exactly who this woman was. This was Clara Fenwick. Clara Aldrich Fenwick. The woman who now lived in the kitchen Eleanor had been building in her mind for 3 months. Clara was not a villain, that was the thing. There was no malice in her face, no triumph. There was only an awkward, uncomfortable recognition, the look of a woman who knew something and wished very much that she did not. She gave Eleanor the smallest possible nod. A nod that said, "I see you, and I am sorry, and I do not know what else to do." Eleanor returned the nod, and that was the whole of it. Thomas Reed was still talking something about the stage line east in the next departure, but his words had receded to a low murmur behind the sound of Eleanor's own pulse. Because this was the part that was worse than she had prepared for. She had prepared in a general way for disappointment. She had not prepared for this, to stand in a strange town at the end of a 1,000-mile journey and look at the ordinary, unremarkable woman who had replaced her and understand that she had not been defeated by something greater than herself. She had simply been less convenient. Clara Aldrich had been here. She had been there. Proximity had won. It was so small a reason to hollow out a life. Eleanor stood very still. She had a rule that she had inherited from her mother, who had been a woman of considerable practical wisdom. The rule was this: you do not weep on public platforms. You do not give strangers the gift of your worst moments. Whatever you feel, you carry it privately until you reach a place where no one can see you, and then you decide what to do with it. She would not weep on this platform. She became aware that Thomas Reed had stopped talking and was looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for a disaster that had not yet arrived. "I understand," Eleanor said. Her voice was completely level. "Please tell Mr. Fenwick I received his message." Thomas Reed looked so relieved that she almost felt sorry for him. He gave a short, jerky nod and retreated from the platform with the speed of someone who has just escaped something unpleasant. And Eleanor Marsh was alone. She stood there on the sun-warped boards of the Millstone Creek platform, and she felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. 28 years old, $3 remaining after the train fare. No family, no home, no prospect. The mountains were tremendous and beautiful in the late afternoon light, and she looked at them and thought with a strange, detached calm that she would not be going back east. She was not sure why. It was not a rational decision. It was something more like a refusal. Ohio had nothing left for her. Going back was not returning to something, it was retreating to a place that no longer existed. She would rather be poor and unknown in Colorado than poor and known in Ohio. She looked at the envelope in her hand. The bills inside she estimated amounted to perhaps $12 or $15. Harold Fenwick's idea of absolution. She folded the envelope carefully and placed it in her pocket, not as a resource, but as a reminder. A reminder that she had come this far on less than anyone expected of her, and she could continue. She picked up her valise. She straightened her shoulders. She had just started calculating options, the hotel, the possibility of work, whether the general store might need a clerk when she heard footsteps on the platform. They were deliberate footsteps, measured and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who has enough weight behind him that he doesn't need to announce himself. She turned. The man who stood a few feet from her was tall and broad in the way of men who have spent their lives doing physical work, not the cultivated width of someone who labors at it, but the natural, unself-conscious size of a man shaped by necessity. He was perhaps 38. His face was weathered to the color of old saddle leather, deeply lined around the eyes from squinting into decades of western sun. His hands, she noticed immediately. She always noticed hands were large and calloused, and marked with the small white scars of ranch work. He wore a plain canvas jacket, trail-worn trousers, and a hat that had seen serious use. He was not a handsome man in any conventional way. He was something else. He was a man who looked like he had earned his face. He held his hat in his hand. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and slightly rough, the voice of a man who speaks rarely and means what he says when he does. "I couldn't help but overhear. I apologize for that." Eleanor looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze she had developed over years of navigating situations that required quick judgments. "And you are?" "Hadley Whitfield. I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles east of town." He did not offer a hand, too much presumption for a first meeting, apparently. "I'm in town for salt blocks and fence wire. I had the misfortune of being near enough to hear what that clerk told you." "It wasn't a misfortune for me that anyone heard," Eleanor said. "There wasn't much I could have done about it." Something moved in his eyes. Not pity. She would have stepped off the platform rather than accept pity from a stranger. It was something closer to recognition, as if he had seen this specific kind of damage before and understood its particular shape. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose there was." He turned his hat once in his hands, a slow rotation, and then he said with the bluntness of a man who has no patience for circling, "I have a situation if you're in need of one." Eleanor waited. "My father is ill," Hadley Whitfield said. "Has been for the better part of 6 months. He doesn't leave his room, doesn't eat enough to keep a bird alive. My wife passed 3 years ago, and the house has—" He paused, looking for the word, and settled on, "It's gone quiet. I need someone to run the kitchen and see to his care. Cook, clean, general management of the household. Room and board, and $10 a month." $10 a month was fair. More than fair. Eleanor had done the calculation before he finished speaking. "What is the nature of your father's illness?" she asked. The shadow that crossed his face was brief but unmistakable. "Doctor says it's his heart. I think it's more that his—" The pause again, the man struggling with words in the way of someone who thinks in actions rather than language. "I think he decided to stop. 6 months ago, he just decided to stop." Eleanor understood this completely. She had seen it before. She had seen it in the faces of old farmers in Ohio who lost a wife of 50 years and simply followed them into the ground within the season. The body could survive a great deal, but the will was another matter entirely. The work would be cooking and household management, she said. It was not a question. She was confirming terms. "That's the whole of it," he said. "Your father, does he speak?" "When he chooses to, which isn't often these days." "And the kitchen," Eleanor said. "What state is it in?" For the first time, something almost like embarrassment crossed his weathered face. "Functional," he said, which told her everything. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not fidget. He did not fill the silence with reassurances or embellishments. He simply stood there and let her look, which she respected more than any sales pitch could have earned. She was in no position to be particular. She was a woman alone in a strange town with $3 in a valise. But she had also learned in 28 years that the manner in which a man makes an offer tells you most of what you need to know about him. Harold Fenwick's letters had been proper but hollow. This man's offer was rough but honest. He had told her the house was quiet. He had told her the situation was difficult. He had made no promises except wages and a roof, which were the only promises that couldn't be easily broken. "All right, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I accept." "Hadley," he said. "You can call me that." He reached for her valise without asking permission, which in other circumstances might have annoyed her, but which in this moment simply read as a man doing a practical thing. He led her to a sturdy buckboard wagon parked in front of the mercantile. As she climbed up onto the wagon seat, she caught one last glimpse of the platform. Clara Fenwick was still there, speaking now to a man Eleanor recognized from the description in Harold's letters. Harold Fenwick was shorter than she had imagined. He looked from this distance ordinary. He looked like a man who had made the easiest choice available to him and would spend the rest of his life not quite looking out certain windows. Eleanor turned away. Hadley Whitfield clicked to the horses, and the wagon began to roll, and Millstone Creek receded behind them, and Eleanor Marsh did not look back. The 5 miles east of town were ridden mostly in silence. Hadley was not a man who spoke to fill space, which Eleanor found she did not mind. She watched the landscape instead, the way the late afternoon light turned the distant peaks to copper and rose the dry grass bending in a low breeze, the occasional pronghorn antelope regarding them with serene disinterest from a distance. He pointed out landmarks in a low informational voice. The creek that ran along the south fence line, the ridge where the cattle sheltered in bad weather, the place where in a wet spring wildflowers came up so thick you could smell them from the road. He said it without sentiment, the way a man describes his property rather than his heart. But Eleanor heard something underneath the spare words. The way you always hear when someone describes land they love, the faint note of a man talking about the only thing that has not left him. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a small valley opening before them in the last of the day's golden light. A log house sturdy and plain, a large barn, several outbuildings in various states of maintenance, a corral with 4 horses, a kitchen garden that had gone mostly to weeds but showed the ghost of what it had once been, the geometric shapes of someone's careful planting, now tangled and overgrown. It was not beautiful. It was a place built entirely for the purpose of endurance, and it wore that purpose plainly. What struck Eleanor as they pulled up before the house was the silence. Not the silence of late evening, of things winding down and settling, a different kind of silence. An accumulated silence, the silence of rooms that had not heard a woman's voice in a long time, that had not heard laughter or singing or the ordinary music of a household in full operation. The silence of a house that had stopped. Hadley unhitched the team and led Eleanor inside. The main room was clean. He had seen to that. At least there was no disorder, no visible neglect of that kind. But it was a cleanliness without warmth. The furniture was sparse and functional. A wooden table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace that held the ashes of its last fire with the stillness of something preserved. A few shelves bearing tins and jars in the manner of a man who had learned to stock what he needed and nothing more. No curtains on the windows, no cloth on the table. No color in the room at all except the variations of brown and gray that are the natural colors of a space that has forgotten how to be inhabited. He showed her to a small room off the main hall, a narrow bed with a patched quilt of faded blues and greens, a washstand, a window looking onto the yard. It was spare to the edge of austere. "It's fine," Eleanor said before he could apologize for it. "It's more than I had an hour ago." He stayed in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who had handled a great many difficult things and was now confronting the unfamiliar difficulty of having done something that required follow-through. "Kitchen's through there. My father's room is at the end of the hall. He may not acknowledge you tonight. Don't take it to mean anything particular." "I won't," Eleanor said. He nodded. He left. She heard his boots on the floor of the main room, then the creak of the front door, and then the particular silence that follows a man going back to the work he understands. Eleanor stood in her small room for a moment. The sun was going down outside the window, painting the yard in bronze. She opened her valise on the bed and took out her mother's herb journal, and she held it in both hands, the worn leather warm under her palms. Her mother had carried this book for 30 years. It smelled like every kitchen they had ever shared, thyme and dried rose hips and wood smoke, and something underneath that was simply her mother, a smell that existed nowhere else in the world now. She set the journal on the washstand. She splashed water on her face from the basin. She straightened her dress, and then she walked into the kitchen. It was the functional disaster she had expected from the word functional. The cast iron stove was cold and filmed with old grease. The pantry was stocked with the particular inventory of a man who eats to survive rather than to live: salt pork, dried beans, flour, a sack of cornmeal, some tinned goods. There were pots and pans hung on hooks, well-made things that had not been used to their full capacity in a long time. There was a pump over the sink that drew cold, clean water. The window over the sink looked out onto the kitchen garden and the beginning of the mountains beyond, And for a moment, Eleanor stood at that window and simply looked, because the view was extraordinary in a way that nothing else about the kitchen was. Then she built a fire in the stove. The kindling caught on the second strike of the match, and the small crackle of it was the first cheerful sound the house had heard in longer than she could know. She found the salt pork and the beans. She found a pot. She found in the back of a low cabinet a jar of dried onions that still smelled sharp and good. She put the beans to soak and began to prepare the simplest possible version of a meal salt. Pork beans cornbread from the meal, because the first night was not about impressing anyone. The first night was about heat and nourishment and letting the house remember what it was for. When Hadley came in from the outbuildings an hour later, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. He did not say anything. His eyes went to the stove where the pan was sizzling and the pot was beginning to steam, and something moved across his face that was too complicated to name, but that Eleanor recognized as the expression of a man encountering something he had gone without long enough to have forgotten he missed it. They ate at the table in near silence. He did not begin until she sat down and served herself. It was a small thing, a basic courtesy, but she noticed it the way you notice small dignities when you have recently been given a large indignity. The food was plain. He ate everything on his plate. When they were done, Eleanor prepared a small tray. Salt pork beans, a piece of cornbread. She carried it down the dark hallway past the doors that stood closed and still to the door at the very end. She knocked softly. Nothing. She knocked once more. The silence on the other side of the door was not empty. It was inhabited, deliberate, the silence of a man who had heard and chosen not to respond. She set the tray on the small stool beside the door. She went back to the kitchen and washed the dishes and went to bed. In the morning, she rose before first light. She dressed, wound her hair, and went to collect the tray from the hallway. The food was untouched, but that was not what stopped her. The tray had been moved. Not disturbed, moved. It had been shifted slightly against the wall as if someone had opened the door in the night and found it there and then shut the door again. He had looked at it. He had opened the door in the dark hours of the night and looked at the food. And then he had closed the door and returned to his refusal. Eleanor stood in the dim hallway for a long moment, the cold tray in her hands. She carried it back to the kitchen. She set the untouched food aside without comment. She built up the fire in the stove and began her second day. She started with the kitchen. She scrubbed the stove until the iron shone. She swept and scrubbed the floor. She washed the windows over the sink until the morning light came through them, clear and unclouded, falling across the wooden table in long, clean angles. She found a crate in the barn and brought it inside and set it on the sill and packed it with soil from the kitchen garden, and into the soil she pressed seeds from a small cloth pouch in her mother's journal. Thyme, sage, flat-leaf parsley. They would not show for weeks. It didn't matter. The act of planting them was its own kind of statement. She found in the root cellar beneath the kitchen a supply of last autumn's potatoes and onions that were past their best but still usable. There was a portion of salted beef that Hadley had apparently purchased and then left untouched. There were dried carrots and some winter squash. It was enough. More than enough. She put a pot on the stove, and she began. She browned the beef first in the good rendered fat she found in a crock by the stove. She browned the onions until they were soft and deeply golden, until they had given up every sharp note and become sweet and mellow and complex. She added water and the potatoes and carrots and a bay leaf from her mother's journal pouch and 3 sprigs of fresh thyme she had found still surviving in the overgrown kitchen garden, and she let it all come to a slow, patient simmer. The smell began to build. It crept out of the kitchen in the gradual, unstoppable way of a good smell out through the doorway, across the main room down the dark hallway. It was the smell of meat and onions and herbs and thyme. It was the smell of something tended. It was above all things the smell of someone caring enough to tend a pot for hours, which is a smell that speaks to something very deep in people, something older than memory, something that lives in the part of the brain where safety and warmth and the presence of another human being are all stored together. Hadley came in at midday and stopped in the main room doorway. He stood there for a full second before he moved. His nostrils had flared. He looked at the kitchen and then at Eleanor, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that was not guarded. It was open briefly the way a door opens when someone inside has forgotten to brace it. They ate the stew with bread she had baked that morning. It was still warm. He ate slowly this time, not the efficient consumption of a man refueling, but the measured eating of a man tasting something. When he was done, he looked at the table rather than at her. "That's the best meal I've had in 3 years," he said. It came out like a confession. She asked him nothing. She let it stand. After he went back outside, she prepared a second tray. A bowl of the stew, rich and dark, a piece of bread, and a small cup of broth with dried thyme floating on the surface. She carried it down the hallway and set it outside August Whitfield's door. She did not knock. She set it there and walked away. It was still there the next morning, untouched. She took it back without comment and began again. This was the shape of her days in that first week. Rise before light. Build the fire. Fill the house with smell and warmth and the sounds of a kitchen in operation. Feed Hadley, who ate everything and said almost nothing, but had begun, she noticed, to linger a few minutes longer after each meal before returning to his work. Carry a tray down the hallway. Collect it untouched in the morning. She did not let the untouched trays discourage her. She was a patient woman, and she understood in a way that required no explanation what she was dealing with. August Whitfield was not ill in any way the doctor's medicine could touch. He was a man who had made a decision to go to follow, to lie down in the quiet room and let the world proceed without him. The decision was not irrational. Grief operates by its own logic. But it was a decision, and decisions could be unmade. She did not try to unmake it by force. She simply continued to cook. She made beef broth so rich and dark it was almost black. She roasted chicken with wild herbs until the skin crisped and snapped. She baked bread every other morning until the yeast smell filled every room. She caramelized onions in the cast iron until the whole kitchen ran with a sweetness so concentrated it was nearly overwhelming. Each dish was chosen not only for its nourishment, but for its smell, the most primal, least resistible of the senses, the one that bypasses every decision and speaks directly to something the body remembers. She was patient, she was stubborn, and she had nowhere else to go. On the seventh evening, as the last of the day's light faded, and the kitchen held the warm, layered smell of a beef and barley soup that had been simmering since morning, Hadley sat at the table mending a piece of tack. His needle moved in a slow, rhythmic pull through the leather. Eleanor stood at the stove stirring. They were, she realized, at ease with each other. Not comfortable in the way of people who know each other, they did not know each other, not yet, but comfortable in the way of people who have established a rhythm. She knew the way he took his coffee. He knew that she started the fire at 5 and wanted no conversation before 6. These were small things, but they were the material from which a household is built. From down the hallway came a sound. It was faint, a dry shuffling, the specific sound of feet moving slowly across old floorboards. Hadley's needle stopped. He lifted his head. Eleanor took her hand from the spoon. The shuffling grew closer. And then a figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. August Whitfield was shockingly thin. His skin was pale to the point of translucence in the lamplight, the bones of his face prominent beneath it. His white hair stood at irregular angles. He wore a nightshirt that hung loose from his skeletal frame, and he was gripping the doorframe with one hand with the careful grip of a man navigating uncertain terrain. His eyes were sharp. They went straight to the pot on the stove. A long silence held the kitchen. Hadley had gone completely still, his hands flat on the table. Eleanor did not move from the stove. Nobody spoke. August Whitfield drew a slow, deep breath through his nose. His chest rose with the effort of it. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When they opened, they were bright with something that was not quite recognition and was not quite grief, but was some complex and private mixture of both. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, cracked at the edges, but unmistakably the voice of a man who had once been formidable. "That's soup," he said. He looked at the pot, not at Eleanor, not at his son, at the pot on the stove with its slow, steady curl of fragrant steam. "That soup," he said again, "could raise the dead." Hadley looked at his father. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he has been bracing against losing for so long that seeing it still present is almost more than he can bear. His jaw moved. He looked down at the table. Eleanor reached for a bowl from the shelf behind her. "Sit down, Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact, as if an old man who hadn't left his room in 6 months appearing in the kitchen doorway was the most ordinary thing in the world. "I'll bring it to you." August Whitfield looked at her for the first time. He studied her with the sharp, evaluating eyes of a man who has spent a long life taking the measure of people. She met his gaze steadily. She did not smile or flutter or perform anything at all. She simply looked back and waited. Something in his expression shifted. Fractionally. the smallest possible concession. He moved from the doorframe. He made his way to the table with the careful steps of a man relearning the distance between one place and another. He lowered himself into a chair with the slow deliberateness of the very weak. He put his thin hands on the table. Eleanor ladled soup into the bowl. Rich, dark, steaming. She carried it to him and set it down without ceremony and went back to the stove. For a long moment, August Whitfield looked at the bowl. Then he picked up the spoon. The kitchen was very quiet. Hadley was looking at his father with an expression Eleanor would spend a long time afterward trying to find words for. She kept her back to the table, stirring the pot, giving them what privacy she could while sharing the same small room. She could hear the sound of the spoon, the small sounds of a man eating. Slowly, carefully, as though each swallow was a decision being made. He ate perhaps a third of the bowl before his hand began to tremble, and he set the spoon down. It was more food than he had taken in 6 months. He sat for a few more minutes in the warm kitchen, breathing the air that smelled of broth and bread and herbs. Then he braced himself on the table and stood and made his slow way back to the hallway. At the doorway he stopped. He did not turn around. "Adequate," he said. And then he was gone back down the dark hall back to his room. There was a silence in the kitchen, and then very quietly Hadley Whitfield put his face in his hands. Eleanor kept stirring the pot on the stove. She did not look. She did not speak. She gave him the thing he needed, which was the same thing August had needed on the other side of a closed door for 6 months, the chance to feel what he felt without being witnessed doing it. Outside, the Colorado night deepened around the small house. The mountains stood in the dark, massive and permanent, indifferent to the grief and the hope and the small human tenacities being worked out in the lit kitchen below. A coyote called somewhere in the dark, a long descending note that was answered by another, and then silence. Eleanor turned off the extra burner and left the soup to rest. She crossed to the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard, at the outline of the barn against the stars, at the enormous sky above the peaks. She reached into her pocket and touched the envelope Harold Fenwick had sent her. Still there. She had not spent the money. She would not spend it. She had decided without articulating the decision even to herself that it would remain there not as a resource, but as a record of where she had started and proof of how far the distance was from there to here. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and took out her mother's journal. She opened it to the last page her mother had written on, which contained a recipe for apple preserves and a note at the bottom that said simply in her mother's handwriting, "Start with what you have. The rest follows." Below her mother's words, in the small, unsteady hand of someone writing by lamplight on the first night in a strange place, was a sentence Eleanor had written the previous evening and not looked at since. "I am not going back." She read it. She closed the journal. She set it on the washstand beside the small lamp, which she then extinguished. The darkness came in fully. Outside her window, the stars over Colorado were extraordinary, more stars than she had ever seen from Ohio. The sky so clear and dark at elevation that the Milky Way was a visible river of light above the mountains. Eleanor Marsh lay in the narrow bed under the patch quilt and looked at the dark ceiling and felt alongside the exhaustion and the loneliness and the particular ache of a day that had contained too much something else. Something small and careful, the way a new thing always is at the beginning. It was not happiness. She was too honest for that. But it was the beginning of purpose, the beginning of belonging to a place which is different from owning it, which is different from being loved in it, but which is, and she knew this, her mother had taught her this, always the first step. She closed her eyes. In the kitchen, the pot of soup settled and cooled on the stove. The fire in the grate faded slowly to orange and then to red, and then to the quiet, gray glow of embers. The house held the warmth and the smell of the meal in its walls. For the first time in 6 months, the house smelled like someone lived there. The days after August Whitfield's appearance in the kitchen doorway did not transform overnight into something bright and resolved. That was not how it worked. Eleanor knew that. She had watched her father grieve her mother for the 8 days he survived her, and she understood that grief does not retreat in straight lines. It moves the way weather moves forward, and then sideways and sometimes back with no reliable pattern, no guaranteed direction. What had happened in the kitchen that evening was not a cure. It was a crack in a wall, and cracks required patience and steady pressure before they became openings. So Eleanor did not change anything. She rose before first light, she built the fire, she cooked. August did not appear in the kitchen the next morning or the morning after that. The tray she left outside his door was still untouched on the second day, though moved slightly as it had been in the beginning. On the third day, she noticed it was no longer precisely where she had placed it. On the fourth day, the broth was gone. Not the solid food, just the broth, the cup she had set beside the bowl, dark and fragrant with time. The cup was empty and rinsed and set back on the tray with a precision that told her everything about the kind of man August Whitfield had once been. She said nothing to Hadley about it. She noted it privately, and she continued. What she changed was the cooking itself. She had spent the first week making nourishing food honest and adequate and warm, the food of recovery. Now she shifted her strategy without announcing the shift to anyone, least of all herself. She began to cook for smell rather than substance. She began to select each day's menu the way a careful person selects words for their resonance, for what they would carry into the air of the house, and what those things in the air would unlock in the people breathing them. She caramelized onions for an hour one morning, low and slow, until the entire kitchen ran, with a sweetness so concentrated it was almost unbearable. She roasted a chicken with wild herbs and garlic until the skin crackled, and the fat rendered into the pan, and the smell of it rose through every room of the small house like something alive. She baked cinnamon bread one gray Tuesday morning, and the smell of cinnamon and yeast and browning crust reached into the dim hallway and under the door at the end of it, with the patient persistence of water finding the lowest point. She was not cooking for hunger, she was cooking for memory. She was cooking for the part of August Whitfield that was still connected to the world, however thin that connection had become, and she was pulling on it the only way she knew how. Hadley watched all of this without comment. He was a man of few words, as she had established in the first days, but she was beginning to understand the specific quality of his silence. It was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a man who processes the world through observation and action, rather than language, a man for whom talking about a thing and doing a thing were not equivalent activities. He watched what she did with a quiet, steady attention that she found she did not mind. He was not intrusive in his watching. He simply noticed. He had begun without discussion or announcement to leave a neatly stacked pile of split firewood just outside the kitchen door each morning. Not the wood pile she knew where the wood pile was, she had found it herself on the second day. A specific personal stack built each morning before she was up, so that when she came into the kitchen and looked out the window, she would see it there ready. She did not thank him for it. He had not done it for thanks. She simply began to factor it into her morning without thinking about it the way you incorporate anything that reliably appears. She found at the back of the root cellar a small box of apple butter someone had put up the previous autumn. 6 jars. She brought them up and set them on the kitchen shelf, and they added a dark amber note of color to an otherwise brown and gray kitchen, and she noticed that Hadley's eye went to them each morning when he came in for coffee. He started coming in for coffee earlier. She did not remark on this either. On the 9th morning after her arrival, she was in the kitchen when she heard something she had not heard in the house before. A sound from down the hallway, not the shuffling gait of a sick man moving toward the kitchen, but a different sound. Something heavier, more deliberate. She heard the door at the end of the hall open and close, and then footsteps moving not toward the kitchen, but toward the front of the house. She looked out the kitchen window. After a moment, she saw August Whitfield appear at the side of the house, moving slowly along the exterior wall toward the kitchen garden. He was dressed not in his nightshirt, but in actual clothes, trousers, a shirt, old suspenders. He moved with the extreme care of a man relearning his own legs, one hand occasionally steadying himself against the log wall. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen garden and stood there looking at it for a long time. Eleanor kept her hands on the bread dough she was working. She did not go to the window. She did not call out. She gave him the same thing she always gave him, the absence of audience, the dignity of privacy, the space to do what he was doing without it being witnessed, and therefore made into something he had to acknowledge. After perhaps 10 minutes, she heard the slow footsteps return along the wall, heard the front door, heard the hallway. That afternoon, the tray she left outside his door came back entirely empty. Bowl, cup, plate, everything cleared. She washed the dishes and said nothing. It was on the 11th day that the thing happened that she had not anticipated. She was not thinking about it when it came, which was perhaps why it landed with such force. She had been cleaning the main room, a thorough cleaning, the kind that involves moving furniture and attending to the accumulated dust of seasons. In the process of moving the old oak sideboard to sweep behind it, the bottom drawer slid partway open on its own, and Eleanor reached to push it shut and stopped. Inside the drawer was a folded apron. It was a woman's apron, practical cotton, in a faded blue check worn soft with use. It had been folded with care. There was embroidery at the lower edge, a small border of running stitches in a slightly darker blue, the kind of embroidery that is not decorative, but personal, the mark of a woman who owned her things. And at the lower right corner of the bib, in small, careful letters, Sarah. Eleanor stood very still. She had known in the abstract that there had been a wife. Hadley had mentioned her once in the context of the house going quiet. She had understood from the kitchen itself, from the good pans chosen by someone who knew what good pans were from the herb garden that had been planted with knowledge and care, that Sarah Whitfield had been a competent and particular woman. But the apron made her real in a way that the abstract knowledge had not. She lifted it from the drawer. It smelled of cedar from the drawer lining, and beneath that, very faintly, something floral. Lavender, perhaps. The cotton was soft as cloth gets only from years of washing and use. She turned it over in her hands. "Put that down." The voice came from the doorway. It was quiet, not angry, or not only angry. It was the voice of someone who has been struck unexpectedly and is using control because they cannot afford not to. Eleanor turned. Hadley Whitfield stood in the doorway of the main room in his work clothes, hat in hand. He was looking at the apron with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something open and raw that he was working to close even as she watched him. Eleanor set the apron on the sideboard. "I'm sorry," she said. The drawer came open. He said nothing. His jaw was set. He looked at the apron on the sideboard, and something moved through him that she could see the passage of even at this distance. A wave of something that had no clean name, that lived in the territory between grief and anger, and the kind of longing that is indistinguishable from pain. She should have stepped back. She should have gone to the kitchen, given him the privacy she always gave, let the moment pass unremarked. Instead, she said quietly, "Tell me about her." He looked at her. The expression on his face was complicated in a way his face was not accustomed to being. He was a man built for the uncomplicated. She could see him deciding. "Why?" he said. "Because you're standing there, holding something in, and the holding is costing you something," Eleanor said. "And because I live in her kitchen, and I think I should know who she was." A long silence. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere near the corral, its liquid three-note phrase rising and falling in the still morning air. Hadley came into the room. He sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace, not the chair closest to the door, which was where he usually sat, but the other chair, the one with the worn arm, where the fabric had been rubbed away, in a specific oval pattern by years of someone resting their hand in the same spot. He sat in it without seeming to notice that he had chosen it. He looked at the empty fireplace. "She was from Missouri originally," he said. His voice was low and careful, a man placing words down the way you place feet on uncertain ground. "Came out here with her family when she was 17. I met her at a church social in the second year I was running this place." A pause. "She didn't think much of me initially. Told her sister I was too quiet to be interesting." Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Almost. "She changed her mind eventually." Eleanor sat down across from him. She did not speak. She was the kind of person who, he stopped looking for it. She made things work. Not just the house, though. The house ran better with her in it than it had any right to. She could fix the pump and bake bread on the same afternoon and still find time to sit with my father in the evening and listen to him talk about the war. He turned his hat in his hands. My father was different then, more himself. She just had a way. He was quiet for a moment. "Fever came fast," he said. "Summer of 1877, 4 days from the first sign to the end. I sent for the doctor in town. He came and told me there wasn't anything to do but wait and keep her comfortable. She was—" He stopped again. The meadowlark had gone quiet. The house held the silence with its particular density. She was gone on the 5th morning, before sunrise. He looked up. His eyes were dry, but the dryness was effortful. "My father went into that room down the hall 3 months later and hasn't come back out for more than an hour at a stretch since. I think he decided that if Sarah was gone and the house was the way it was, there wasn't much point in—" He stopped. "I did better than he did. I kept working. Work was something I could do. But the house—" He looked around the main room. The house just stopped. Eleanor looked at the apron on the sideboard, the embroidered name at the corner, the careful fold. She sounds like she was worth grieving, Eleanor said. He looked at her. It was a direct look, the kind that searches for something and is not sure what it will find. Yes, he said. That was all. But the way he said it was complete. He stood up. He was already retreating into himself, back into the practical, back into the language he was comfortable with. I've got fence line to check, he said. I'll have dinner ready at 6, Eleanor said. He nodded. He picked up the apron from the sideboard and folded it back the way it had been and replaced it in the drawer and pushed the drawer shut. Then he put his hat on and walked out the front door, and Eleanor heard his footsteps crossing the yard toward the barn. She sat for a moment in the chair across from the empty fireplace. Something had shifted in the house. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, nothing visible yet, but something measurable, something real. She got up and went back to the kitchen. 3 days after that, Harold Fenwick came to the ranch. Eleanor was at the sink working through a pile of cooking apples she had traded for at the market in town, 2 pies she had decided, and a batch of preserves when she heard the buckboard on the approach road. She looked out the window. She recognized the rig from what she had seen briefly in Millstone Creek. She wiped her hands on her apron and kept working. He knocked at the front door, which no one who belonged here did. Everyone who belonged here came to the kitchen. Hadley was in the barn. Eleanor dried her hands and went to the front door and opened it. Harold Fenwick was shorter than she had expected from his letters. He was a man in his mid-40s with the comfortable build of someone whose business was selling things, rather than making them a decent face that was currently wearing an expression of considerable personal discomfort. He held his hat in both hands. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Mr. Fenwick," she said. He cleared his throat. He looked at a point somewhere to the left of her ear. "I came out on a matter of business with Mr. Whitfield," he said. "Some supply arrangements for the fall." He paused. I wanted to say that I'm aware the circumstances of your arrival were—" "Come in," Eleanor said. "I'll get you some coffee." He followed her to the kitchen with the hesitant step of a man who had prepared for multiple possible versions of this conversation and was not sure which one was happening. Eleanor poured coffee and set it on the table and went back to her apples. "Miss Marsh," he said again, "I want you to know that when I wrote those letters, I fully intended—" "How is Clara?" Eleanor asked. He stopped. "Your wife," Eleanor said pleasantly, quartering an apple with the smooth efficiency of someone who has done it 1,000 times. "How is she, Shum?" "She's well," Harold Fenwick said after a pause. "She's very well." "I'm glad," Eleanor said. She meant it. She had decided somewhere in the first week at the ranch that she meant it. Not because she was a saintly woman, she was not, but because being glad was more useful than being bitter, and she had work to do. Harold Fenwick sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his prepared apology, and he watched Eleanor Marsh move through her kitchen quartering apples, seasoning the pie crust she had already prepared, moving with the unhurried competence of a woman entirely at home in what she was doing. And after a while he stopped looking for an opening for his speech and just drank his coffee. "I'm sorry, Miss Marsh," he finally said simply, without preamble. "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick," Eleanor said. She did not look up from her work. I handled it poorly." "Yes," she agreed without heat. Another silence. "You seem," he said carefully, "to be managing." "I am," she said. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He set his cup neatly in the center of its saucer with the precision of a man who has been well trained by someone. "I'll go find Mr. Whitfield," he said. "He's in the barn," Eleanor told him. "Second stall from the left, most likely." He stood, put his hat on, and paused at the kitchen doorway. He looked at her once more, and she could see him arriving at some internal conclusion, filing something away, making some private accounting of how things had turned out. "Good day, Miss Marsh," he said. "Good day, Mr. Fenwick," she said. She heard the back door, heard his footsteps cross the yard toward the barn. She kept working on the apples. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and warm pastry and the clean green scent of the cut fruit. Outside the window, the afternoon light slanted gold across the yard. Hadley came in for dinner that evening and was quiet through most of the meal, which was not unusual. But when she set the pie on the table, the first pie she had made here, golden-crusted and fragrant, he looked at it for a moment before he cut into it, and then he said without looking up, "Fenwick came by." "I know," Eleanor said. "He had coffee." A pause. Hadley served her a slice and then himself. I imagine he apologized. He did. Hadley looked at his pie. And I thanked him, Eleanor said. He ate a bite. She watched him try to identify what he had just tasted. Is this a different apple, he asked. Wine sap, she said. I traded 6 eggs for a bushel at the market in town. He nodded. He ate another bite. Something in the set of his shoulders was different than it had been at breakfast. Less contained. She could not have explained what made the difference, only that she noticed it the way she noticed everything in this kitchen, the way she had become finely attuned to the small weather systems of this house. You didn't have to be kind to him, Hadley said. No, Eleanor agreed. But it cost me nothing, and I find bitterness is poor company. He looked up at her then, a direct look, one of his evaluating looks, and she let it land without flinching. Whatever he was looking for, she had nothing to hide from it. He went back to his pie. He's not a bad man, Hadley said. He's a small man. There's a difference. I know, Eleanor said. They finished the meal in the usual comfortable quiet, and Eleanor found she meant what she had said to Harold Fenwick. She was managing. Better than managing. In the plain practical rhythm of this ranch, in this kitchen, she was finding something she had not expected to find. Not happiness, not yet, but the specific satisfaction of a person whose skills are fully used, whose days have shape and purpose, whose hands are never idle. She was beginning to understand more than she had been promised by Harold Fenwick's letters. And it had arrived without promises at all. It was on the 14th morning of her time at the Whitfield ranch that August appeared, not in the doorway, but at the table. Eleanor had been working at the stove since 5, putting together a beef and barley soup from a recipe in her mother's journal. The handwriting on that page more careful than usual, the margins marked with her mother's small annotations, a note about the importance of skimming the fat, a reminder to add the barley late so it didn't go to mush. She had been absorbed in the work and the pleasure of following a recipe that was also a kind of conversation with the dead, and she did not hear him until the chair scraped. She turned. August Whitfield sat down at the table. He was dressed properly again. He had combed his white hair. He moved with the deliberateness of a man for whom every movement required decision, but he was upright and his eyes were clear, and he looked at the pot on the stove with the focused attention of a man who has rediscovered interest. Eleanor turned back to the stove. She stirred the soup. She said conversationally, as if he had been sitting at her table every morning, "It'll be another hour." "I can wait," August said. His voice was stronger than it had been on the night he first appeared. Still rough, still carrying the damage of months of disuse, but stronger. She had the sense of a man slowly reconnecting himself to the apparatus of living. She made him coffee without asking. She set it in front of him and went back to the stove. He sat for a while without speaking. She let the silence run. Somewhere outside, Hadley was doing morning chores. She could hear the specific sounds of it. The barn door, the voices he used with the horses, different from his human voice, lower and steadier. "You moved Sarah's herbs," August said. Eleanor glanced at the windowsill. The crate she had planted was there, the first pale green shoots just beginning to show above the soil in the past day or two. "I replanted some of them," she said. "The garden was overgrown. I took cuttings of what I could identify and started them inside." August looked at the small crate. "Thyme," he said, "and sage and parsley. There was some oregano too, but it hadn't survived." He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window toward the kitchen garden with the expression of a man reconsidering something. "Sarah planted that garden the spring after she and Hadley married," he said. "Said she couldn't cook properly without knowing what was in her herbs." He paused. "Particular woman." "It sounds like it," Eleanor said. "Stubborn," he said, and there was something in the word that was entirely different from criticism. "The best cooks usually are," Eleanor said. Something moved in August Whitfield's face. Something that had the shape of a smile without quite arriving at one, but close enough that she could see where it would have been. They were in that particular quiet, the comfortable quiet, the one she was learning to distinguish from the heavy quiet of the house's grief, when the back door opened and Hadley came in from the morning chores. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. His father was sitting at the table, drinking coffee, a thing he had not done in 6 months. Eleanor watched Hadley take this in. She watched him perform the extraordinary control of a man who will not allow himself to show what this costs him to see, because showing it would make it fragile. He walked to the stove and poured himself coffee and sat down at the table in his usual chair, and said to his father, "Cold morning." "Getting colder," August said. "Felt a change in it yesterday." "Supposed to be dry through August, though," Hadley said. "That's what they said last year," August said. Eleanor kept her back to the table and stirred the soup. She was aware of the two men behind her, aware of the extraordinary, ordinary conversation happening between them. This exchange of words about weather, which was not about weather at all, but about something much larger and more essential. And she kept her hands on the spoon and her eyes on the pot and gave them the room they needed. The soup was ready at 7. She ladled it into bowls and brought it to the table, and the three of them ate together for the first time. It was a small thing, and it was everything. August ate slowly and with concentration, the way a man eats when he is relearning the pleasure of food rather than simply processing its necessity. He ate most of the bowl. He ate a piece of bread. He sat back and looked at the table when he was done with the expression of a man who has finished something effortful. "Your mother made this soup," he said. He was looking at Hadley. Hadley looked up. "Different herbs, same base." August looked at the pot on the stove. "The barley, the way the broth's got that dark color." He paused. "Your mother made it the same way, boy." His voice had changed register, gone somewhere lower and more particular. "Don't let this house go quiet again." The kitchen held those words. They were not, Eleanor understood, a compliment to her cooking. They were a request, perhaps a demand from a man who had spent 6 months lying in a dark room and had just this morning decided that the room was no longer where he intended to remain. They were addressed to his son. They were the most important thing he had said in half a year, dressed up as a casual observation about soup. Hadley's jaw moved. He looked at the table. He looked at the pot on the stove. His coffee cup was empty and his hands were flat on the table, and his expression was the expression of a man receiving something he had been afraid to want. He got up and went outside. Eleanor listened to his footsteps cross the yard and stopped somewhere near the corral fence. She heard nothing after that. She did not need to. August pushed himself up from the table with the careful effort of the infirm. He steadied himself. He looked at Eleanor with the sharp, clear eyes that had been in that weathered face for 68 years, through the war and the westward journey, and the building of this ranch, and the loss of the woman who had made it a home. "You'll do," he said. Then he walked back down the hallway to his room. Eleanor stood in the kitchen alone. The soup pot was still warm on the stove. The morning light came through the clean window and fell across the table with its 3 used bowls. She sat down at the table. She had not allowed herself in the 14 days since arriving at this ranch to think too far forward. She was a practical woman, and she had been operating on the terms of the arrangement: cook, clean, care for the old man, earn her wages, keep her head down, and her options open. She had not permitted herself the luxury of imagining a future here because the future was not something that had been offered. But sitting now at the table in the warm kitchen, she became aware of something she had not named before. She did not want to leave. It was not a dramatic revelation. It did not arrive with force or clarity. It arrived the way the time seedlings had arrived in the window box, quietly, incrementally, so gradually that you might almost miss it until the day you looked and saw that something was growing that had not been there before. She did not want to leave this kitchen. She did not want to leave this table with its worn surface marked by years of use. She did not want to leave the early mornings when the house was hers alone, or the sound of the horses in the corral, or the specific way the afternoon light moved across the mountains. She did not want to stop feeding August Whitfield back into the world, or watching Hadley Whitfield become incrementally a man who came in from the cold and stayed a little longer each time. This was the frightening part. Not the external threats, not the whispers of gossip from town, not the precariousness of her situation, not even the fundamental uncertainty of what all of this was or could become. The frightening part was internal. She had come to Colorado running from an ending, and without noticing the precise moment it had happened, she had begun to want something. She had not let herself want something in a long time. It was 3 days after the morning August came to the table that Meredith Voss appeared at the ranch. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden working the overgrown beds with a hoe, reclaiming the geometric shapes of someone's original planting from the weeds that had moved in during the years of neglect. It was satisfying work, physical and visible, the kind of work that shows you clearly what you have done. She had her sleeves rolled and her hat on and dirt on her hands. She heard the wagon before she saw it. A good rig, well-maintained, driven by a woman alone. The woman was perhaps 42, handsome in a composed, deliberate way. Dark hair shot with silver, pulled back severely. Clothes that were practical, but notably better than practical. She pulled the horse up at the yard gate and descended from the wagon with the ease of a woman accustomed to managing herself. She was carrying a covered dish. "Miss Marsh," she said, walking toward the garden with the purposeful stride of someone who has decided how this visit will go. "I'm Meredith Voss. I run the Voss farm about 2 miles north." "Mrs. Voss," Eleanor said. She set down her hoe. "I wanted to welcome you to the area," Meredith Voss said, with the particular warmth of a woman who uses warmth the way other people use tools. She held out the covered dish. "I brought a pound cake." "Thank you," Eleanor said, taking it. "Come in and have some coffee." In the kitchen, Meredith Voss sat at the table and looked at the room with the assessing eyes of a woman doing an inventory. Eleanor did not miss the inventory. She made the coffee and set the pound cake aside and waited. "You've done wonders with the kitchen," Meredith said. "It was quite neglected from what I understand." "It needed attention," Eleanor said. A pause. "And Mr. Whitfield, both Mr. Whitfields, they're well." "They are." "That's good to hear. Gus particularly. The whole town has been concerned." She accepted her coffee with a gracious hand and looked at Eleanor over the rim with eyes that were doing considerably more than the face around them suggested. "It must be an unusual situation for you." "Is it?" Eleanor said. "A young woman," Meredith said, arranging the words with care. "Living alone on a ranch with 2 men. People talk Miss Marsh. I'm sure you're aware of that." "I'm aware of it," Eleanor said. "Of course." The smile. "I only mention it because I've always felt that women in unusual arrangements benefit from being forewarned about how things can appear." A slight pause. "How things are being discussed in certain quarters." Eleanor looked at Meredith Voss. She looked at her directly with the full attention of a woman who knows exactly what is being said and why and by whom. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I appreciate your candor. I do. And I'll be equally candid in return." She set her coffee cup down. "I am here because I was hired to do a job, and I am doing it. I am here because August Whitfield has gone from refusing food to eating breakfast at this table, which took 6 months and a great deal of stubbornness. I am here because this household needed someone to keep it from coming apart entirely." She met Meredith's eyes. "If certain quarters find something to discuss in that, I can't stop them. But I don't intend to change what I'm doing on account of it." Meredith Voss was quiet for a moment. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that shifted incrementally from assessment to something slightly more complicated, something that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. "You're very decided for a woman in a difficult position," she said. "I found that being undecided in difficult positions makes them worse," Eleanor said. A beat. Meredith set down her own cup. "Well," she said with the slightly modified warmth of a woman recalibrating. "I hope the kitchen garden comes along. Sarah always kept a beautiful garden." "It's coming along," Eleanor said. "I have thyme and sage coming in the window box. Another few weeks they'll be ready to go in the ground." Meredith glanced at the window box at the pale green growth there. Something crossed her face that Eleanor could not fully interpret. "Good day, Miss Marsh," she said, and rose and left the kitchen with the same deliberate stride with which she had entered it. Eleanor watched the wagon from the kitchen window as it turned out of the yard and headed back toward the road. She picked up the pound cake. She tasted a piece. It was good. Meredith Voss was a capable baker, which was almost certainly beside the point. She put the cake on the shelf and went back to the garden. That Saturday, she went into Millstone Creek for the weekly market. She went for eggs and salt and a piece of flannel she needed for patching. And she went alone, which she always did, which was a thing she needed to keep doing, because the alternative was to be a woman who stayed out of sight, and that was not a thing she intended to become. What had changed since her first visit to town was small but perceptible. Nods that had been friendly were now slightly restricted. A woman who had stopped her to admire her herb selection 3 weeks ago now found something to examine in the opposite stall at the relevant moment. 2 women speaking outside the feed store fell briefly quiet when she passed and resumed after. Eleanor bought her eggs and her salt and her flannel. She spoke to the stall keepers she knew. She held her chin at the angle her mother had taught her level not raise because raise was arrogance and level was dignity. She completed her business without hurry. But on the wagon ride back alone on the road with the mountains ahead and the town receding behind, she let herself feel it. The cold of it. The specific loneliness of being looked at slantwise, of being the subject of conversation that stopped when you arrived. She had not done anything wrong. She had done everything right. In fact, worked hard, kept herself well-maintained every propriety the situation allowed. And it would not matter. She knew that. In a small town, what mattered was the appearance of things, and the appearance of things was outside her control. She drove the wagon home in the late afternoon light and brought in the supplies and stoked the stove and started dinner. She did not tell Hadley what had happened in town. She did not tell August, who was now present at all three meals, and had begun in the past 2 days to offer brief, dry observations about the food that she was beginning to understand were the highest form of praise available from him. She did not tell anyone. She stood at the stove that evening, and she worked through the feeling the way she worked through any difficult thing, not by confronting it, but by putting her hands to work and letting the activity of the body settle what the mind could not resolve alone. She made a pot roast that took 2 hours, and she made biscuits, and she made a bread pudding with some stale bread and the last of the apple butter from the cellar. It was a lot of food for 3 people. It was exactly enough food for what she needed it to be. They ate in the kitchen by lamplight, the 3 of them, while the wind came up outside and moved through the grass and around the corners of the solid log house, with a sound that in another context might have been lonesome, but in this context was simply weather. August told a long story about a mule he had owned in 1863 that had more common sense than half the officers in his regiment, and Hadley listened with the expression of a man who has heard this story before and does not mind hearing it again. Eleanor ate her pot roast and listened to the old man's voice fill the kitchen and thought about how a month ago that voice had been silent, and how a month ago this table had held one man eating to survive, and how what was sitting around this table now was something that had no formal name, but felt nonetheless like what a household was supposed to be. After dinner, after August had made his slow way down the hall to his room earlier every evening, now not from weakness, but because he had begun to sleep properly, the sleep of the living rather than the death-adjacent stupor of the previous months, Hadley stayed at the table. Eleanor was washing the dishes. The kitchen was warm and the lamp cast its yellow circle, and outside the wind moved through the dark. He stayed so long that she finally turned to look at him. He was watching her in that way he had developed without seeming to know it. The observing look, the one that had started as the practical attention of an employer and had become something less categorizable. He was not embarrassed to be caught at it. He simply held the look and let it be what it was. "You went to town today," he said. "Yes." "How was it?" She turned back to the dishes. "Fine." A pause. "Ellie," he said. It was the first time he had used the shortened version of her name. She did not know when he had decided to. Perhaps he had not decided. Perhaps it had arrived the way things arrived in this kitchen gradually, without announcement, until it was simply there. She did not turn around. "I'll handle it," he said. She did not ask what he meant. She understood what he meant. She was also not sure she wanted it handled in the way he was likely to mean, which was directly and with the bluntness of a man for whom the shortest distance between 2 points was the only line worth drawing. "Not yet," she said. Quiet. "All right," he said. He pushed back from the table. She heard him go to the door and take his coat from the peg. "I'm going to check the horses." "I'll leave coffee on the stove," she said. The door opened and closed, and she was alone in the kitchen. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She crossed to the window box and looked at the thyme seedlings in the lamplight, small and determined in their crate of good dark soil, pushing steadily upward in the warmth of the kitchen. Another few weeks, she had said not yet. There would be a yet. She knew that now in the way she knew what a kitchen needed when she walked into it for the first time. She could feel the shape of what was coming, the way you feel the shape of a room, even in the dark, by inference, by the evidence of small things, by the particular quality of the air. Not yet. But there was a yet. And that was the most frightening and most necessary thing she had allowed herself to know since she stepped off the train in Millstone Creek and watched the last of her previous life retreat from her in the form of a clerk with a hat he didn't know what to do with. She turned off the lamp over the sink and left the coffee on the stove and went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened her mother's journal to the last page. Below the 2 lines already written the recipe notation and her own declaration, she took the pen from the washstand drawer. She held it for a moment. Then she wrote a 3rd line, small and careful, below the others. It read, "Something is growing here." She capped the pen. She closed the journal. She lay down on the narrow bed under the patch quilt and listened to the wind moving around the house and the distant sound of Hadley's voice in the barn. speaking to the horses in that low, steadying register. And the house held all of it. The wind and the voice and the warmth from the stove, and the smell of the dinner that had been, and the coffee that was still. And Eleanor Marsh lay in the dark and felt for the first time since Ohio that the ground beneath her was solid. October came to the Whitfield ranch the way it always came to that part of Colorado, without apology and without ceremony, simply arriving one morning in the particular quality of the light, a coolness in it that had not been there the day before the sky, a deeper and more serious blue, the aspen groves on the hillsides beginning their slow annual fire of gold. Eleanor had been at the ranch for 11 weeks. She knew the place now, the way you know a thing when you have given it your daily attention without reservation, the way the floorboards spoke differently in dry weather, the way the morning light moved across the kitchen table from east to west over the course of an hour, the way the horses in the corral grew restless before a weather change in a manner that was more reliable than any almanac. She knew that the second stair from the bottom had a loose board that Hadley kept meaning to fix, and she knew that August took his coffee with no sugar in the morning and one spoonful at noon, and she knew that Hadley, when something was working itself out in his mind, would find a small piece of wood and his pocket knife and whittle without seeming to know he was doing it. She had begun to know them, and that knowing had its own weight, its own specific gravity, pulling her toward this place with a force that she had stopped pretending was merely the comfort of steady employment. The kitchen garden was in. The thyme and sage she had started in the window box were transplanted, established, growing with the stubborn tenacity of things that have overcome difficulty and emerged stronger for it. She had planted garlic in the back beds for next spring. She had put up 16 quarts of apple preserves and 8 of wild plum jam and a dozen jars of pickled beets from the last of the garden's yield. The pantry shelves held these things in their neat rows, and sometimes she stood in the pantry doorway just to look at them, the amber and the ruby and the deep jeweled purple of them in their glass jars, because they were the most visible evidence of what she had been doing here, the most tangible record of a summer spent in the act of provision. August was by any reasonable measure a changed man. He came to the table for every meal now. He dressed each morning in the methodical way of a man who has reestablished a relationship with structure and intends to maintain it. He had begun in the past 2 weeks to walk out to the corral in the afternoons, short walks at first, no further than the fence rail where he could rest, but the walks were getting longer. The doctor from Millstone Creek had come out 2 weeks prior at Hadley's request and had stood in the kitchen afterward with the expression of a man confronted with evidence that contradicts his previous conclusions. His heart is stronger, the doctor had said, significantly. Hadley had looked at Eleanor across the kitchen table in the way he had developed of communicating things he would not put into words. August, for his part, had told the doctor that the change was owing to the soup, which was not the full truth, but was not untrue either. He had also, in the way of a man who has come back from somewhere and wants to settle the accounts of his time away, begun to talk. Not at length, not in the expansive way of people who use words freely, but in the deliberate, measured way of a man who is choosing what to say with the care it deserves. He talked to Eleanor most often in the late afternoons, when Hadley was still out with the cattle, and the kitchen held the warmth of the day's cooking, and the light came through the clean window at the angle that made everything look more deliberate than ordinary. She had learned in these conversations that he had fought in the war, the Union-side Missouri Regiment, 4 years, that he carried in his body, in his bearing, in his specific economy with sentiment. She had learned that he had come west in 1866 with his wife Margaret, who had died of complications in childbirth when Hadley was 12, and that Hadley had from that point been raised primarily by his father, in the particular way boys are raised by fathers alone, with competence and care and an almost complete absence of the emotional vocabulary that mothers generally provide. She had learned that Sarah Whitfield's arrival in this house had done something for both of them that neither had known to ask for. She had learned gradually what she was working with, and it had made her more, rather than less, certain of where she stood. One afternoon in the second week of October, August came into the kitchen while she was straining the last of a batch of beef broth. He moved differently now than he had in July, still careful, still deliberate, but with something of his former authority restored, as if the body were slowly remembering the posture of a man who had once commanded things. He sat at the table and watched her work. "You remind me of Margaret," he said. It came out of the silence without preamble in the way his observations usually did. "Not in looks, in manner, the way you go at things." Eleanor glanced at him. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, he said. Margaret was a woman who decided things and then did them without a great deal of fuss in between. He looked at his hands on the table. I used to tell her she was the most efficient person I'd ever met. She told me efficiency was just another word for not wasting time on what couldn't be helped. She sounds sensible, Eleanor said. She was. He paused. Sarah was different, more given to music and beauty and the social graces. But both of them had that quality. He looked at Eleanor. The quality of deciding. She set down the ladle. She looked at him. You've decided something, he said. It was not a question. She considered deflecting. She was still capable of deflection when the situation called for it. But August Whitfield, at 68, returned from his 6 months at the edge of voluntary extinction, was not a man you deflected without cost. He had the particular clarity of someone who has looked at what death looks like from the inside and come back with very little patience for the indirect. I've decided to stay, she said, if the situation permits it. August looked at her for a long moment. Sarah would have liked you, he said. Not because of how you cook, though you cook very well, because you don't give up. He turned his coffee cup once on the table. She'd have said you were worth the stubbornness. Eleanor felt something tighten in her throat. She looked at the window at the kitchen garden at the time in its neat row. She'd have been right, she said. Not about herself, about Sarah. August made the sound that was his equivalent of a smile. She usually was, he said. He pushed himself up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking out at the kitchen garden for a moment. He stood there in the afternoon light with the particular stillness of a man who has made his own peace with something, and then he turned and walked back down the hallway to his room for his afternoon rest. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen. Something is growing here, she had written in her mother's journal 6 weeks ago. She had not been wrong. The letter came on a Wednesday. It arrived with the weekly post that Hadley collected in town, a slim envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand, the return address a law office in Zanesville, Ohio. Eleanor saw it on the kitchen table when she came in from the garden set there by Hadley, who had said nothing about it, which told her something about the expression on his face when he had seen the Ohio postmark. She washed her hands. She dried them. She sat at the table and opened the letter. It was from an attorney named Caldwell representing the estate of one Roy Alderman, a second cousin of her father's, whose existence she had been vaguely aware of but never had reason to think about. Roy Alderman had apparently, in the process of settling an old property debt, identified the last parcel of land that had belonged to her parents, a 3-acre remnant on the eastern edge of their former farm that had been separated from the main sale and held in a kind of legal suspension ever since. The parcel was small. It was not worth much, but it owed back taxes 2 years' worth, and those taxes were due to the county by the 1st of December, or the land would go to public auction. The amount owed was $31. $31. Eleanor set the letter on the table. She had earned $10 a month for 11 weeks. After the small purchases she had made for the household, the flannel, the seeds, the apples she had traded for at market, she had saved just over $28. The envelope Harold Fenwick had given her on the platform in July, which she had never spent, contained $14. In her room in the calico pouch inside her mother's herb journal, she had exactly $42 to her name. $42. She looked at the letter, $31 to keep the land, the last 3 acres of her parents' farm, the ground where her father had put his hands into the soil every spring for 30 years, the ground where her mother had grown her kitchen garden, the garden that had produced the herbs that had gone into the journal sitting on Eleanor's washstand right now, that had fed her and taught her and ultimately brought her to this kitchen in Colorado. $11 remaining, which was barely a month's wages, which was nothing like enough to feel secure. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and began making dinner. She did not say anything to Hadley that evening, or the next morning. She needed to think about it alone first, which was the way she had always made decisions privately, thoroughly, without the complication of other people's responses, until her own response was settled. She thought about it while she cooked. She thought about it during the long, quiet afternoons when the house had its own specific peace. She thought about it at night in the narrow bed listening to the wind come down off the mountains. The land was her past. It was the only physical remnant of the people who had made her who she was. To let it go, to fail to act and watch it be auctioned off to a stranger felt like a second loss, a loss she was choosing rather than suffering. But $31 was most of what she had. And the situation here was, for all its warmth and all its growing rightness, still technically an employment arrangement. There were no promises beyond the wage. There was no guarantee of what came next. Spending most of her savings on a piece of Ohio land she would likely never stand on again, based on a feeling about a Colorado ranch that had not yet been spoken aloud by anyone, was the kind of decision that required a certainty she was not sure she was entitled to feel. She was still thinking about it on the 5th day after the letter arrived, when she came back from the garden to find Hadley at the kitchen table, the letter open in front of him. She stopped in the doorway. He had not taken it from her room. It must have fallen from her pocket or been left somewhere she had not realized. He was not reading it. He had evidently already read it. He was sitting with it open on the table in front of him, with the particular stillness of a man who has arrived at a conclusion. He looked up when she came in. $31, he said. Yes, she said. You've got enough saved. Barely, she said. She came into the kitchen. She was not angry that he had read it. She found, examining herself, that she was not surprised. It would leave me with almost nothing. Almost nothing is not nothing, he said. No, she agreed. But it requires a level of confidence in the future that I'm not certain is warranted. He looked at the letter. He looked at the table. He was working something through in the unhurried interior way. He had the processing that happened somewhere behind his eyes, while the rest of him remained still. The land belonged to your parents, he said. Yes. You grew up on it. I did. He said nothing for a moment. Send the $31, he said. Hadley. It's your land, he said. It should stay yours. Whatever happens here, that land ought to stay in your family. You don't have enough family things left to be letting them go to auction. She looked at him across the kitchen, at the weathered face and the careful eyes and the hands flat on the table, and she thought about the firewood stacked outside the kitchen door every morning, and the lock he had fixed without being asked, and the way he had said her name, Ellie, for the first time without deciding to, because some things arrive before the decision does. That's not your choice to make, she said. No, he said. It isn't. He met her eyes. But I'm saying it anyway. Send the money, Ellie. I'll cover your wages for December if the month gets tight. The ranch can carry that. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and felt something shift in the weight of the room. You're offering to loan me money, she said. I'm offering to make sure you don't lose something worth keeping because the timing is bad, he said. There's a difference. She thought about Harold Fenwick. She thought about men who made offers and what those offers revealed about them. She thought about the specific economy of this man who did not spend words or gestures without meaning them, who had offered her a job on a train platform in plain language and had delivered exactly what he promised. All right, she said. She crossed to the table. She picked up the letter. She folded it along its original lines and put it back in her pocket. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. Dinner smells good, he said. Chicken, she said. Another hour. I'll be in from the east fence by then, he said, and rose and put on his hat and went back out into the October afternoon. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she sat down at the table and took out the letter and took out her pen and began to compose her response to the attorney in Zanesville, Ohio. She wrote carefully and clearly, confirming her intention to settle the back taxes on the parcel and requesting the appropriate payment instructions. She signed it Eleanor M. Marsh. She folded it and addressed it and set it by the door for the next post. Then she went back to the chicken. The letter confirming receipt of her payment and the formal transfer of the tax lien into her name arrived 3 weeks later, just past the middle of November. She set it with her mother's herb journal in the calico pouch. It was a small thing, 3 acres of Ohio land she had never seen and might never see again, but it was hers, and the having of it felt like a kind of ballast, a weight that kept her from drifting. November moved deeper into itself. The first snow came on a Tuesday light, an early more gesture than commitment, dusting the peaks in the highest pastures and melting by noon. But it was the announcement of what was coming, and the ranch responded to it with the subtle shift of preparation. The cattle moved to the lower pasture. The barn reinforced against the wind, the wood supply assessed and augmented. Eleanor made thick soups and heavy breads and a beef stew that took all day and filled the house with a warmth that the stove alone could not have managed. She made pies when the occasion didn't require them, because it turned out that occasion was not actually required. She made a pot of chili one evening that August declared the finest thing he had eaten since a meal in a farmhouse outside of St. Louis in the autumn of 1864, which she understood to be the most significant compliment in his available repertoire. She and Hadley had developed over the months a language that lived almost entirely below the level of spoken words. It was built of the small things, the firewood in the fixed lock, and the early coffee, the chair he always left at the exact angle she preferred at the table, the way he had begun to describe the weather conditions in the morning, not as information, but as conversation, the specific way he said her name when he meant something more than what he was saying. She was not naive about what it was. She was 28 years old, and she had not lived this long in proximity to the human heart without learning to read its signals. She knew what was there. She had known it in the way you know things before you can say them since the October morning he had sat at her kitchen table and told her to send the $31. But he had not said it, and she had her own reasons for not pushing, not coyness, not strategy, but the genuine patience of a woman who understood that some things cannot be hurried without being broken, and that what was building in this house was worth waiting for. It was Meredith Voss who forced the question. She arrived on a gray Thursday morning in the first week of December, unannounced, driving her good rig, with the particular purpose of a woman who has organized herself for a specific outcome. She knocked at the front door again. Eleanor answered it. Meredith Voss was carrying a document, not a dish this time, a folded set of papers that she held with both hands, with the careful grip of someone who believes what she is carrying has weight. "Miss Marsh," she said, "I need to speak with Mr. Whitfield." "He's in the barn," Eleanor said. "I'll get him." "Perhaps," Meredith said, "it would be better if I spoke with him privately." Eleanor looked at her. "I'll get him," she said again, and left Meredith standing in the main room. Hadley came in from the barn with hay on his jacket and the expression of a man interrupted from work he'd rather be doing. He looked at Meredith Voss and at the papers, and his face settled into the particular stillness that preceded his most considered responses. "Mrs. Voss," he said. Meredith set the papers on the table. Eleanor, who had gone to the stove and taken up a ladle with the manner of someone engaged in cooking, was present in the room without being obviously present, and Meredith chose not to address this directly. "I've been asked by several members of the community," Meredith said with the careful precision of someone who has prepared her language, "to bring a matter to your attention. There are formal concerns regarding the living arrangement at this ranch." She gestured at the papers. "A number of residents have signed this letter. It requests that the arrangement be regularized or concluded." Hadley looked at the papers. He did not pick them up. The kitchen was very quiet. The soup was on the stove and it was making its patient sounds, and the smell of it was in the room, and there was snow in the forecast, and the fire in the hearth was burning steadily, and Eleanor stood at the stove and waited. Hadley looked at the papers for a long moment. He looked at Eleanor. She did not look away. He picked up the papers. He read them. He read them completely, which took a while because Hadley Whitfield did not skim things. He applied the same thoroughness to reading that he applied to fencing and to cattle, and to the carving of small things from pieces of wood. He folded the papers and set them back on the table. He turned to Eleanor. And Eleanor Marsh, who had been patient for 4 months and who had kept her own counsel through a long summer and a golden autumn and the beginning of a Colorado winter, met his eyes and waited for what came next. "Ellie Marsh," Hadley said. His voice was exactly what it always was, low and unhurried and absolutely certain of itself. He did not dress the words. He did not arrange them for effect. He said them the way he did everything, plainly, directly, without ornamentation. "Will you marry me?" It was barely a question. It was more like a statement of what he had already decided and was now extending to her as an offering rather than a conclusion. "Here is what I want," he was saying, "and what I want is you not as employee or arrangement or the woman who happens to be in my kitchen, but as the thing that makes this house what it is, as the person without whom all of this returns to what it was before July." He said, "Not because of what's in those papers." He said, "Because I don't want to come home to a quiet house anymore." Meredith Voss was standing very still. Eleanor set the ladle on the hook beside the stove. She untied her apron and folded it and set it on the counter. She looked at Hadley Whitfield, at the weathered face that she had been reading for 4 months, like a landscape learning its moods and its silences, and its rare, unmistakable moments of openness, and she felt in her chest the particular complicated warmth of something earned rather than given. She said, "I'll give you my answer." She crossed to the kitchen doorway. She looked at Meredith Voss, who was in the difficult position of having come to deliver a threat, and found herself instead witnessing something else entirely. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Voss," Eleanor said. Her voice was completely even. "I hope the road back isn't too icy." Meredith Voss looked at her, looked at Hadley, read the room with the accurate eyes she undeniably possessed. She gathered her papers from the table. She put on her hat. "Good day," she said, and walked out of the kitchen, and Eleanor heard the front door, and then the creak of the wagon, and then the sound of the horse moving out of the yard. The kitchen was quiet. Hadley had not moved. He was standing by the table with the expression of a man who has said the most important thing he knows how to say, and is now waiting with the particular patience of someone for whom waiting is a practiced skill. Eleanor crossed to the window box. The thyme and sage were still there, smaller in November, quieter but present, alive, continuing the business of growing with the unsentimental persistence of things that have decided to exist. She looked at them for a moment. Then she went to the small shelf in the corner of the kitchen where she had put some weeks ago the object she was thinking of now. She had found it in the barn in late September on the shelf above the workbench where Hadley sometimes spent an hour in the evenings. It was a small carved figure, a bird roughed out in pale pine, the shape of it unmistakably avian, the wings half lifted as if preparing for flight. The detail work was not finished. The feathers were suggested but not defined. The body was smooth in some places and still rough in others. A thing in process, a thing not yet arrived at what it was trying to be. She had set it on the kitchen shelf because she had not known what else to do with it, and because it seemed wrong to leave it in the barn where weather could get to it. She picked it up now. She brought it to the table. She set it down in front of Hadley. "Finish it," she said. He looked at the bird. He looked at her. "Then I'll give you my answer," she said. Something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. It moved through him and settled, and what remained when it was done was not what had been there at the beginning. It was something quieter and more certain, the expression of a man who has understood something and is glad of the understanding. He picked up the bird. He turned it once in his hands, weighing it, assessing where it was and where it needed to go. He set it in his palm with the careful attention of someone recommitting to a task. "It'll take a few days," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," Eleanor said. He looked up at her. There was a quality in that look that she had no adequate word for. It was too much to be called warm and too specific to be called love, though it contained both of those things. It was the look of a man who has been empty for a long time and has found, without quite being able to say when it happened, that he is no longer empty. "No," he said. "I don't reckon you are." He put the bird in his jacket pocket. He went out to his work. Eleanor turned back to the stove and attended to the soup, and the kitchen held the ordinary warmth of an ordinary December afternoon, which was the most extraordinary thing she had known in a long time. He finished the bird on a Sunday. He brought it to the kitchen table after the breakfast dishes were cleared, while August sat in his chair by the window with his coffee and the week-old newspaper he had started reading again in October. He set it on the table in front of Eleanor without ceremony. She picked it up. The feathers were done, each one etched with the kind of patience that has no interest in being noticed, the work of a man who carves the way he does everything thoroughly, without shortcuts, attending to the parts that no one may ever look closely enough to see, because it is the nature of the man to attend to them anyway. The wings were half raised, and the breast was smooth, and the head was tilted with the specific alertness of a bird that has not yet decided whether to stay or go, a bird caught in the precise moment of choosing. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever held. She set it down. She looked at Hadley. August turned a page of his newspaper. "Yes," Eleanor said. Hadley was still for a moment, just still absorbing it the way he absorbed everything, without rush, letting it settle fully before it became something he had to respond to. "Yes," he said, as if confirming it to himself as much as to her. August put down his newspaper. He looked at the two of them across the kitchen table, and his face did what it did on the rare occasions when something moved him past his defenses. It simply showed what it was carrying. Undisguised, the face of a 68-year-old man who had come very close to not being here for this, and was consequently not inclined to take it for granted. "Well," he said, "it's about time." And that was the whole of the engagement of Hadley Whitfield and Eleanor Marsh. No flourish, no grand declaration beyond the one that had already been made. Just two people in a warm kitchen on a December morning, with the mountains outside the window, and a small carved bird on the table between them, and an old man turning back to his newspaper with the satisfied air of someone who has watched a thing take its right shape after a long patience. They were married the following April. A traveling preacher came through Millstone Creek on the second Saturday of the month, which was as much ceremony as either of them required. The main room of the ranch house was as clean as Eleanor could make it, and it smelled of the bread she had baked that morning, and the apple blossoms that had opened on the two old trees behind the barn, and that she had put in a jar on the table because they were there, and they were beautiful, and that was reason enough. August stood as witness. He had dressed with particular care that morning, his best jacket, his hair combed, and he stood beside the fireplace with the straight-back grave attention of a man who understands the weight of what is being witnessed. His eyes were bright and dry and entirely clear. Eleanor wore her second-best dress, which was her best dress that she had let out and altered in the evenings over the past month, until it was something she felt suited to the occasion. In her hair she had tucked a small sprig of thyme from the kitchen garden, which had come back strong and full in the March thaw, and was now growing with the unself-conscious abundance of a plant that has found its ground. The preacher was a tired man in a decent coat who said the words with the unhurried solemnity of someone for whom solemnity is a genuine rather than performed condition. He looked at the two of them, and he said the words, and they said the words back, and then it was done. Hadley took her hand after the preacher had gone, the way he did most things simply and without performance, because the thing itself was enough and required no additional framing. They stood in the main room, the three of them in the April afternoon light, and August opened the bottle of good whiskey he had apparently been saving for something and poured 3 small glasses and handed them out. He raised his. "To the woman who stayed," he said. Eleanor looked at her glass. She looked at the room, the curtains she had made for the windows in January, the cloth on the table, the color and warmth and livingness that had come into this space since the July evening. She had walked into a cold kitchen with a cast-iron stove and the determination of a person who was not going back. She looked at Hadley. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to know best in all his repertoire. The quiet wonder of it, the slight disbelief, the look of a man who cannot entirely account for his own luck and has stopped trying to and has settled instead for gratitude. "To the woman who stayed," he said. She touched her glass to theirs. The spring came fully in the weeks that followed. The way spring comes in Colorado, not gradually but all at once, as if the landscape had been waiting for the exact right moment and then simply released everything simultaneously. The aspen buds broke open overnight. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. The kitchen garden came back with a vigor that made Eleanor laugh out loud one morning alone in the garden at the sheer unstoppable greenness of it. She planted more. She expanded the beds Hadley helped her turn in the evenings after supper. She planted tomatoes for the first time, in sweet corn, and a row of sunflowers along the fence that had no practical purpose whatsoever except to be the exact yellow of a good summer afternoon. August walked to the corral and back every day without stopping to rest at the fence. He had put on weight. He had opinions about everything again, which Hadley bore with the patient exasperation of a son who has been given back his father and does not intend to complain about the manner of the gift. The wooden bird lived on the mantelpiece. Eleanor had put it there on the morning after the wedding in the center of the mantelpiece, where it could be seen from the table, from the kitchen doorway, from the chair by the fire. She had set it there without discussion, and Hadley had not moved it, which she took to mean it had found its right place, and right places did not require argument. She thought about it sometimes, the bird caught in the moment of choosing wings half raised, the question still open, the answer still becoming. It seemed to her an accurate thing, a truer image of what had happened here than any more finished or resolved image could have been. They had not arrived at something concluded. They had arrived at something that was still in the process of becoming what it was, and that was not a lesser thing. That was the nature of any living thing worth tending. On an evening in late May, after the dinner dishes were done, and August had gone to his room and the night was warm enough to sit outside for the first time, Eleanor and Hadley sat on the step of the kitchen door and looked at the dark shapes of the mountains against the last of the western light. He had his pocket knife out. He was working on something she could not yet see what it was, a new piece, the beginning of a shape emerging from the wood. She had her mother's journal in her lap. She had been reading through it from the beginning, the recipes and the remedies, and the small, marginal notes her mother had left over 30 years of keeping it. And she had been making her own notes in the margins, where the pages had space additions, variations, the things she had learned in this kitchen that her mother's kitchen had not taught her. She opened to the last page, the 3 lines she had written in the months of her first year. "I am not going back. Something is growing here." She picked up her pen. Below the 2 lines, she wrote a third. It grew. She closed the journal. Beside her, Hadley worked in the growing dark with the concentrated patience of a man who is satisfied with where he is. The small sounds of the knife on wood, the crickets starting up in the grass, the horses settling in the barn. The mountains held the last of the light on their peaks, and then released it, and the stars came out. The extraordinary Colorado stars, more than any reasonable sky should hold. "What are you making?" she asked. He held it up. In this fading light, she could see the roughed-out shape, small, four-legged, definite. "Not sure yet," he said. "Something for the mantelpiece. Needs company up there." Eleanor looked at the shape in his hand. She leaned against his shoulder. He did not move away. Some loves do not arrive with ceremony. They do not come announced or promised or delivered on schedule. They arrive the way the best things always do, in the daily, in the ordinary, in the unremarkable accumulation of small, reliable acts performed by two people in the same direction over a sustained period of time. They arrive like the smell of bread baking in a cold house, like firewood stacked outside a kitchen door before sunrise, like a cup of broth left on a stool outside a closed door, returned to again and again without comment until the door opens. They arrive like a woman stepping off a train at the end of everything she had planned for and finding in the ruins of that plan the beginning of something she had not known to want and could not now imagine living without. Eleanor Marsh had come west looking for a life. She had found one. Not the life she had been promised, not the life she had packed her valise for, not the life outlined in the careful letters she had folded and unfolded until the paper softened at the creases. Something more honest than all of that. Something that had asked her to earn it rather than simply receive it, that had required her steadiness and her patience and her stubborn, unflinching willingness to stay. She had stayed. And the house, which had been silent for so long, was quiet in an entirely different way. Now the quiet of a place that has people in it who are at peace. The quiet that is the opposite of emptiness. The quiet of a kitchen at the end of a good day, with the fire banked and the dishes done, and the smell of everything that has been made and tended and shared still present in the warm air of the room. Outside, the Colorado night deepened, and the stars turned in their ancient courses above the mountains, and in the small warm house at the edge of the valley, a woman and a man sat on the kitchen step in the dark, and the man carved something out of a piece of wood, and the woman held her mother's journal in her lap, and neither of them needed to say anything at all.